please remember to keep your microphone off during the presentation. Presentation today is scheduled to run until 12 o'clock, and we've got about 15 minutes dedicated to questions at the end of that time. If you are asking a question when we get to the Q&A, you can either pop your hand up or put something in the chat, and we'll try and direct traffic as best we can in the time that we've got. And slides today will be emailed out after the presentation, along with the recording and an evaluation form, which is really helpful feedback for us. So if I could encourage you to fill that in, it really does just take 30 seconds. It's a really quick opportunity for us to get some really good, insightful information as we're developing the offer from the Specialist Centre. During the webinar, you can access the closed captions. To do that, if you click More on your Teams toolbar and then Language and Speech, then CC Live Captions. I will cut and paste that into the chat as well. So on to our speaker. Dr. Deborah Harrison is a research design methodologist based here at the Specialist Centre for Public Health at Newcastle. Deb's background is in public sector research and policy, and she's worked with organisations including local authorities, voluntary and community sector, and the NHS. Her research has spanned a range of issues, including work quality, child poverty, homelessness, and mental health, and she's also taught undergraduate and postgraduate research methods. So with that wealth of experience, we're delighted to have Deb here to present on a topic which is so fundamental to all aspects of the research cycle. So Deb, I'll pass over to you now.
Right, hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for the introduction, Nicola, as well. So as Nicola said, the focus of today's webinar is on designing ethical research. And we've very much sort of pitched this at an introductory level, so we're not expecting any kind of prior knowledge of research ethics or anything like that. And just to clarify what we're focusing on today, so we're talking about research with human participants. So basically what we mean by that is any research that involves people in some way. So that could be anything from a survey to an interview-based study to some kind of creative method, anything where you have people involved in what you're doing. We're also today focusing on ethical principles, not ethical approval processes. And I will mention at the end of the webinar how those two things fit together. But our focus today is very much on the practical things that you can do within your research project to make sure that it's as ethically sound as it possibly can be. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's why everyone thought they were here. So just to give you a very quick overview of what we'll cover. So I'm going to start at the very beginning and just very briefly mention what we actually mean by research ethics and why it's such an important part of the research process. I'll then spend most of the webinar talking you through some of the key principles of research ethics. And for each one of those, I'll just briefly explain what we mean by the particular principle, and then I'll give you some examples of how you might try and address that within different sort of stages of your research. And then at the end of the webinar, I'm going to leave you just with a few additional considerations of things that we won't get a chance to talk about today, but are still things that you might want to go away and think about or do a bit of extra reading around. And I'll also leave you with a list of resources as well, so links to different websites and things where you might want to go away and find some more detailed information. And then, as Nicola said, we should hopefully have sort of 10-15 minutes at the end to get through as many questions as we possibly can. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. So what do we actually mean by research ethics, and why is it so important? So research ethics is described as a set of moral principles that guide us as researchers, all the way from when we're first designing our projects through to when we deliver the research, and also when we disseminate the findings as well. So we're talking about the whole research process. And we can kind of think of research ethics as a sort of code of conduct or a set of behavioural standards that guide us as researchers. And essentially, at its heart, it's about how we treat the people that take part in our research. So research ethics very much emphasises our duty of care to our participants, and also making sure that we carry out our research in a way which is honest and respectful of all of the people involved in it. And we can see research ethics as being important for a whole load of different reasons. And so obviously we can argue that it's just the right thing to do. You know, we shouldn't be doing research if there's a chance of harming the people who are involved in it. But it's actually really helpful for a lot of practical reasons as well. And so thinking about things like protecting our reputation, so both as individual researchers and also our employers' reputation as well. Having a strong ethical stance can also help us to provide assurances. So it might be that we want to apply for funding and we're asking for money from someone to do our research, or it might be that we want to publish the findings and report them in different places. And so having a kind of strong ethical stance is usually something that would be expected in those kind of situations. Research ethics can also help us to meet legal obligations. So there is a bit of overlap between sort of what's ethical and what's legal, particularly around GDPR and data protection regulation, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the webinar. And then finally, research ethics is really important just to sort of build and maintain public trust in research. And I know over the last few years there's been a lot of discussion around how do we try and strengthen public trust in both in research and also the institutions that do research. So it helps us with that as well. So I'll just introduce you now to so these are the key principles of research ethics that we will look at in this webinar. You'll see slightly different versions of this list depending on what specific ethical framework you look at. So there's dozens of different ethical frameworks that you can find online. But almost all of them include these key themes in one form or another. So you'll see slightly different language, but they generally all share the same common themes. At the moment, this probably just looks like a load of jargon, but hopefully by the end of the webinar, you will know what we mean by each one of these. And I actually sort of deliberately kept the technical language in just because it can be really important if you're applying for funding or you're writing up a research report. It's generally expected that, for you to use language around things like informed consent, things like confidentiality. So I've kept the jargon in, but we'll try and explain it as well as I possibly can as we go through. And then finally, just to say, we've got this, there's 8 principles. We don't have a huge amount of time, so this will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I'll spend a lot more time on the first 4 principles because they're the really kind of foundational principles of research ethics, and take a little bit more explaining, whereas some of the later ones are a little bit more self-explanatory. So I'll sort of whiz through those ones a little bit more quickly when we get to those. So let's move on then. So we'll think now about each of those ethical principles. So we'll go through all 8 and just think about each one in turn and how we might address each one within the research process. So the first principle of research ethics is the avoidance of harm. And it's most basic. So if you strip research ethics right back to its absolute core, essentially what it's about is maximising the benefit of your research, both for the individuals who are involved, but also for society as a whole. While at the same time minimising any potential risks or potential harms involved in your research. So we can kind of see any research project or any potential research project as this kind of balancing act or trade-off between the risks and the potential reward of the research. And when we think about harms and risks, we're not just thinking about physical risk, we're also thinking about it could be potential emotional or psychological harms to people, it could be financial harms as well. And we think about those both for the participants, but also to sort of wider people as well. So we would think about potential harms to the researcher and also to any wider groups as well. So it might be that the findings of your research have implications for a particular group of people or a particular community, for example. So we think about those harms in a very kind of broad sense. And our aim as a researcher when we're designing our research is to just try and minimise those risks and mitigate them wherever we possibly can. So just to continue on that, so in research ethics, we often think about research in terms of levels of ethical risk. So this will look a bit different to other sort of risk assessments that you might be more familiar with in sort of day-to-day work. But the main things to note here is that generally any research which involves human participants, so any research that involves actual people in what you're doing, would generally be considered at least medium risk from an ethical viewpoint. And we would pay particular attention to any research that has some kind of gatekeeper involved. So by a gatekeeper, what we mean is someone who you rely on or require permission from in some way in order to be able to access your participants. So that could be someone like a service manager, for example. And the reason we pay particular attention to that is because there is this sort of potential there for bias or coercion to creep into the study if we don't sort of really check and manage that relationship really well. So So that's sort of medium risk, and then you can see there's a whole list there of types of research that we would consider to be higher risk from an ethical perspective, and that includes any research that involves children or adults who are potentially vulnerable, any research that involves particularly sensitive topics or anything that might have the potential to cause distress or psychological harm to someone, as well as any research where informed consent can't be taken, and I'll mention more what we mean by that very shortly. As well as any research where participants could be identified in some way as well. So there's a whole range of different research topics that we would consider higher risk. What's important to say here is that just because something is considered high risk, that doesn't necessarily mean that the research shouldn't be done. It just means we have to put a bit more time and effort into considering, first of all, whether the research is worth doing in the first place. So thinking back to that kind of trade-off between potential risk and potential reward. And then also we need to put quite a lot of work into just thinking how we might mitigate some of the risks and make sure that we plan for those as much as we possibly can. So it's always worth, when you're planning a research project, it can be helpful just to think about which of these ethical risk categories your study would fall into, and that can give you an idea of sort of the types of issue that you might need to address and how you might mitigate them. And we'll focus on some of these kind of higher risk areas as we go through the rest of the webinar. Okay, so I'll move on now to the next two principles. So I've merged these two principles together just because they're often talked about together, and it can be a bit easier to talk about them as one. So these two principles taken together are kind of the sort of foundation of ethical research, if you like. So what we have here is, so principle 2 is voluntary participation and the right to withdraw, and principle 3 is informed consent. And essentially what these principles are about are making sure that people only take part in your research if they absolutely want to do so, and making sure that you give them enough information for them to be able to make that choice. So what these two principles say is that participation should be voluntary, and that it should be appropriately informed. And you might see the term fully informed there as well, so the sort of different language that's used. So for a decision to take part to be voluntary, what we mean by that is that that decision has to be freely given and free from any kind of pressure or undue influence from anybody. And for the decision to be fully informed, what that means is that we provide clear and comprehensive information to people in advance to enable them to make a meaningful decision about whether or not to take part. So a few elements of this that are very important. So one is making sure that people have enough time to consider the information that you give them. They might want to discuss it with people, maybe a friend or a family member, before they decide. And we also need to make sure that they have an opportunity to ask you questions as the researcher as well before they make that decision. Another thing that's important here is that participants must actively opt in to take part in your research. So for example, if you invite someone to take part and then you don't hear back from them, that isn't enough to assume that they're happy to take part. They have to actually actively tell you that they want to be involved in the research. And then finally, the sort of final crucial element of these two principles is that the participant has to be able to withdraw from the study at any time without having to give you a reason. And without any negative impact on them. So that could be on a service that they're accessing or support they're receiving, or it could be on their employment or their training, depending on what the focus of your research is. So that's voluntary participation and informed consent. And the way that we address those two principles is what we call through what we call the informed consent process. And essentially this is the process of providing information to people and then getting that person's agreement if they decide that they do want to take part. So I've included an example here of what the informed consent process might look like, and this example is the sort of standard approach to any kind of in-person research method. So that might be an interview or a focus group or some kind of creative method, for example. So what we would usually do is we would send an invitation to take part with a participant information sheet, and I'll mention more about that on the next slide. So we would usually send that in advance. I think last time I checked the guidance, sort of at least a week in advance is advised. I would say a couple of weeks is really good. You don't want to send it too far ahead because then people might have forgotten by the time you come back to them, but a couple of weeks would usually be ideal. And then if the person comes to you and says that they're interested to take part, what we would then usually do is at the start of the research activity, so say if we were doing an interview with someone, We would also give them a verbal explanation of the research and make sure that there's time built into the process for questions. So I would usually allow about maybe 15 minutes or so within the interview time to make sure that there's enough time there. So you would make sure that you've answered any questions that they've got, and then you would check whether they're still happy to take part. And if they are, then you would usually get them to sign a written consent form to confirm that you've given them the information and they understand what's involved and that they're happy to be involved. What we would then do, so you would then do your interview or whatever it is that you're doing, and then at the end of that time, what we would then do is just make sure there's also time in at the end to do a bit of a verbal debrief and make sure there's no questions at the end as well. And actually, often there will be questions that come up at the end. So say, for example, if someone feels like they've overshared or they might have mentioned a colleague's name or something like that, people do often want to just double check around things like confidentiality. So it's important to make sure that there's some time in for that as well. Depending on the focus of the research, you might want to consider a written debrief. So say if it's a particularly sensitive topic, say if you're doing research on mental health or something like that, it might be that you feel it's worth having some kind of written debrief sheet, which might include sources of support or something like that. So that's an option depending on what the focus of your research is. And then finally, we would always ensure that the participant has our contact details in case any questions come up further down the line. So for any in-person method, it's worth saying that the verbal elements are really crucial to make sure that you can check, understanding for people before they take part, and also check whether they've read the participant information sheet, because people often haven't when they come to the interview or whatever method you're using. So it's important to sort of make sure that you've got time booked in for that. And so it's worth saying as well, so there's variations on this process. So the example I've given you here would be for in-person methods. If you were doing something like a survey, of course, you wouldn't have the verbal elements of that, but the rest of it is fairly similar. So we would usually still send out the invitation with a participant information sheet. And then generally what we would do is embed the consent form in the landing page of the survey and do that in a way where people can only then continue on to answer the questions if they've consented to take part at the start of the survey. And then, you would still make sure that your contact details are very clear and things like that. So there's a lot of information online around different informed consent processes for different scenarios, and some of the resources that I'll give you at the end, hopefully you'll be able to find the example for your particular situation. So one thing to say on this is that, on paper, this process looks very straightforward, but actually in reality, it's really quite complex, and there's a lot of different things to think about when we're thinking about informed consent. One of the things that we need to think about is accessibility, and generally we would provide participant information in written form, and written tends to be seen as the kind of gold standard both for the information sheet and also the consent form. The reason it's seen as the gold standard is because it offers the most protections both to you as the researcher and also to the participant as well, because it gives you this kind of exact written record of exactly what information you've given them and exactly what they've agreed to. But that said, that's not always appropriate, and there are alternative options if required. So it might be that you want to create like a video version or a spoken version of your consent form. I know a lot of researchers that do research with children, for example, might use a video version rather than the written form. So there are sort of different alternatives that you can use if you feel like a written version might not be appropriate for your participant group. And then finally, it's really important just to think about power dynamics within this. And I mentioned on the previous slide around the potential of coercion, and implicit coercion can actually be really tricky to spot. So for example, if you're a service manager and you want to do some research with the people who use your service, even if you're incredibly well intentioned and you have a really good relationship with those the people that use your service, your status as the manager might mean that people feel like they can't say no. So even if you get on with them really well, they still might not feel like they can say no to taking part. So it's really important to think not just about the procedural side of it, but things like who the invitation comes from, if there's any particular power dynamic in there that we need to be sort of concerned about. So that is informed consent. I've included a list here just of the sorts of things we would usually see in the participant information sheet. I won't read through this entire list just for the sake of time, but this document is a really key document from a research ethics perspective, and you might see this seen as a study information sheet as well. I tend to call it a study information sheet just because it feels a little bit less clinical, but I think it's sort of individual preference a lot of the time. But essentially what we want from this document is for it to be a kind of one-stop shop for all of the key information that a person might need in order to make an informed decision about whether or not to take part. So it includes things like the purpose of the research, how you'll be using their data, any conflicts of interest, if there's anyone funding the research, who that is, and that sort of thing. One thing that's really important to remember is that informed consent isn't just about the information that you give to people, but it's about whether or not they can understand it. So it's really important to spend a bit of time on this, and try and just make sure that you avoid any jargon, avoid any technical language, think about any accessibility or communication needs, and how much information to give people as well. And it can be really useful if you can get an external pair of eyes to have a look at this when you've drafted one. It can really help just to spot any sort of jargon that people might not understand. Okay, so that was an introduction to informed consent. So let's move on now to think about Principle 4. So Principle 4 is anonymity and confidentiality. And essentially, this principle is all about limiting access to personal data in your research and making sure that participants can't be identified in your research. And one thing that's important to say here is that anonymity and confidentiality are things that we need to think about at all stages of the research process. So I think sometimes there can be a little bit of a misconception that if you just replace people's names with pseudonyms or respondent numbers or something like that when you report the findings, that is enough to make your data anonymous. But actually it's really quite complex, and it's something that we need to think about all the way through the process. So all the way through from recruitment through to how we analyse and disseminate the findings. It's also really important in the study information sheet to be very clear exactly what it is that you're promising to people, and being careful not to overpromise as well. And the UK Data Service has got some really useful examples of, so they have example wording around confidentiality and anonymity, and they also have some examples of wording to avoid, which I think is really helpful as well. So you might sometimes, for example, see someone say something like, your views will be treated in the strictest of confidence, for example, but actually that's really quite difficult to uphold a promise that is that strong. So it's really important to just think about what exactly what you're promising and what you can't promise as well. So just to think about how we might address this within the research process. So it's really important to think about anonymity and confidentiality in the recruitment process, particularly if you've got a gatekeeper involved. So that what you want is to create a situation where that gatekeeper doesn't know who is taking part in the research and who isn't taking part. So usually what we would do is, even if the invitation has to go through a gatekeeper, we would then ask people to contact us directly as the researcher if they're interested or want to find out more, and that helps to kind of break that link with the gatekeeper. It's also really important to think about kind of location of your research and privacy concerns. So is the research happening in a place where people will know who's taken part and who isn't? Is it in a place where you might be overheard, for example? So there's a lot to think about there. And I do a lot of workforce research, and I generally just offer a range of different options. So if I was going to interview someone, I would offer to go to them at their workplace. I would offer for them to come to me at my workplace, or I would offer, somewhere, maybe a cafe or some other kind of public place where it would be mutually convenient. So I think a lot of the time it's just about flexibility and allowing enough options for the participant to make sure that they're comfortable with what the plans are. And then the bits that you're probably more familiar with is around sort of limiting the amount of personal data that we collect, so only collecting data that we really need, making sure we don't share it with anyone outside the research team. And then there's a whole load of sort of tactics that we can use of what we call depersonalizing the data. So that will be things like removing names and any other identifiers, and it might be that you replace them with a pseudonym or a respondent number or something like that. And it's important there to remember that it isn't just names that can be identifiable. So it could be something like a job title, it could be a location, it could be where somebody went to school or something like that. There's all kinds of different bits of information that could be an identifier. So it's important just to sort of put a bit of time into thinking about that. If you're doing any kind of group methods, so for a focus group, for example, you might want to think about ground rules that you might want to set. So it could be, for example, that you make an agreement that you'll only use each other's first names rather than surnames, so that there aren't any surnames on the recording, for example. And then finally, it's important just to make sure that you don't forget about third parties. So as the researcher, you're responsible for making sure that any third parties involved in your research also adhere to these principles. So that could be if you're using a transcription company, it could be if you have other people involved in helping you organise meeting rooms and things like that. You need to make sure that they're also aware of what the requirements are around confidentiality and anonymity. So let's move on then to principle number 5. So principle number 5 is respect rights and dignity. And if we think about research essentially as being about a set of relationships, this principle is all about how we approach those relationships. So it's about how we interact with the people that take part in our research and how we make sure that we respect their rights and their dignity as individuals. So essentially, I guess it's kind of about how we make people feel who take part in our research, you know, whether that's before they take part or during or after the process as well. And within this, there's a whole range of issues which are worth considering. So thinking about things like accessibility and inclusion requirements, thinking about cultural sensitivity as well. So it's always worth asking yourself the question, are there any groups of people who are excluded from taking part in my research or might not have a positive experience of the research because of the way that you have designed it? And that could be something as simple as the time of day that you decide to do your field work. It could be, you know, if you're expecting people to travel to you, what does that mean in terms of who can't take part? And we would pay particular attention within this to any potentially vulnerable groups of people that we might be working with, or any particularly sensitive topics. So if you're doing research, you know, it might be something on mental health. It might be that you're doing research with people who have experienced the care system, for example. We would pay particular attention to just making sure that we approach this in a way which is very respectful. The SRA, so the Social Research Association, also talks about financial harms, which I think is really helpful. I think often we expect people to take part in our research and it can sometimes be at a financial cost to themselves, and that's really important, both in terms of thinking about who that rules out and whether it means that, you know, people on low incomes can't take part, but also thinking about how we address that and how we sort of reimburse and value people's time from a financial perspective as well. And then finally, we would think about the implications of the research findings. And so it might be that your findings have implications for a particular group of people, or they might have the potential to exacerbate a negative stereotype, for example, about a particular group. So it's important just to be really sensitive to this when we're reporting the findings. And of course, we don't want to misrepresent the data or anything anyway, but it's just about being kind of sensitive to how it might be interpreted by somebody else. So in terms of how we might address this in the research process, so we would address these issues through very careful accessibility and inclusion planning. If you're able to involve public or community groups in the design of your research, that can really help with this principle, because it basically gives us an external pair of eyes on what we're doing. So it might be that there's a particular topic that you don't think is sensitive particularly, but it might be that other people have a different perspective. So just getting as many sort of external pairs of eyes on what you're planning to do can be really helpful for this element. And then otherwise, I think a lot of this really is just about being very careful about about the questions that you're planning to ask people. A lot of it, I think, is around listening skills and just paying a lot of attention to non-verbal cues. So when you're conducting your research, just paying a lot of attention, and, you know, if you get the impression that someone's starting to feel uncomfortable, you know, just thinking through how you would deal with that and how you would support the person. And again, thinking about similar issues in any debrief process as well. So thinking about what kind of support, what kind of information you should leave people with, to make sure that it's sort of you know, is respectful of everybody involved. And then finally, as I mentioned on the financial harms, just thinking about how you might reimburse people's expenses and time. And if you don't have funding available to reimburse people, you could maybe consider, you know, it might be online options, it might be you traveling to them. So there's sort of different ways that you can design your research, depending on how much sort of funding you have as well. So that's principle number 5. So we'll move on to principle 6. So principle 6 is researcher independence, integrity and transparency. And this principle essentially is all about the conduct of the researcher. So what this principle says is that research should be conducted in a way which is honest and open and accurate. And then of course the converse of that is that we should avoid any deception or dishonesty or misrepresentation. And that misrepresentation could be of the data, it could be of the findings, it could be of the participants. So part of this principle is about maintaining independence as much as you possibly can as a researcher. And I know that that's easier often in academic research than it might be if you're in a local authority or you're in a voluntary sector organisation. But what this principle says is that, so we should avoid conflicts of interest wherever we can. Where we can't avoid them, we just need to make them explicit. So it's just really important to make sure that they're clearly there in your participant information sheet, and they are also there when you verbally explain the study to people at the start of whatever it is that you're doing as well. So just making sure that your participants are fully aware, and then they can factor that into their decision about whether or not to take part. And of course, as you can imagine, within this principle, there's a lot of attention to misconduct, or what the Social Research Association calls questionable research practices. And it's worth thinking about these, that they're on a spectrum from kind of deliberate acts of plagiarism or falsifying data. So I think that's often the sorts of issues that we associate with misconduct. But actually, misconduct it's not always deliberate. It can be influenced by various pressures that we might be under as researchers. So it could be that you're under a lot of time pressure to get the work finished, and so you're under pressure to kind of cut corners. It could be that you're under pressure from a funder or from a manager or someone to report the findings in a particular way. So it might, to show them in a positive light or something like that. So there's actually a lot of pressures that we can be under, which can sometimes allow these kind of questionable research practices to creep in without us sort of maybe identifying it as misconduct. So again, there's a lot to think about here. And ways that we might address this in the research process. So obviously trying to manage, but also reporting conflicts of interest or any commercial interests. Making sure that we have clearly defined lines of responsibility and accountability can be really helpful, especially accountability for the ethical side of the research. And then I think a lot of this really is just about being very careful in how we analyse the data, making sure that we have a really strong understanding of the methods and the topic before we go into the research, and just making sure that we acknowledge any limitations as well. So they might be methodological limitations or limitations within the sample or something like that. It might also be our own limitations in terms of our skill set. And, so if someone's sort of trying to get you to do some research and you don't really have the skills to do it, it's about kind of acknowledging that as well, and making sure that we don't take on things that we don't feel like we have the skills to do. And then finally, I think the self-reflexivity can be really helpful in this. So just thinking of, so reflexivity is the process of thinking about both how we influence the research as individuals, and also how the research influences us as well. So if you get a chance to have a sort of reflective diary or anything, then that can really help you to sort of uncover any of these issues if they might be starting to creep into your research. So we'll move on, we're nearly there. We've got two more left. So principle 7 is around responsible data management, analysis and reporting. So this principle is all about how we look after the data that we collect, how we keep it safe, and also how we analyse it and report it in a responsible way. I won't spend too long on this because I feel like a lot of this is things that we all probably do anyway as part of our day-to-day role. But really it's about so safe and secure data collection, thinking about how we store the data, and also how we dispose of it as well. So how long are we keeping the data for? What will we do with it at the end of that time frame? And as you can imagine, we pay particular attention here to the storage of any kind of personal or sensitive data, and that links to data protection and GDPR and things like that. And we need to think as well just about making sure that we uphold any anonymity and confidentiality promises that we've made to people at the start of the research, and then being responsible and accurate with our reporting, which is something that I mentioned on the previous slide. So just in terms of how we address it, a lot of this will be things that you already do. So thinking very carefully about secure data storage, and thinking both about electronic data, but also physical data as well. So you might have things like signed consent forms, and thinking about how you would dispose of the research, and thinking about things like password protection, and making sure that it's a secure server that you're uploading your data to and things like that. One thing that's worth mentioning for anyone who's doing qualitative research, it's important to really think about any kind of devices that you might use to record interviews. So if you are using an audio recorder, you might be using your phone to record interviews or something like that. It's really important that you upload the data as soon as you possibly can onto whatever secure server you're using. So it's probably your kind of work server, and then deleting it from that device as soon as possible. And I would say particularly if you're using your mobile phone, because the chances of, if you're carrying your mobile phone around with you day to day, the chances of it going missing or something, it's not unheard of. So just making sure that you don't have any data on there that would be identifiable, and bearing in mind that on these kind of recordings you will often have a lot of identifiable data like people's names and things like that. And then I think some of this as well is just about being very careful about how you check the interpretations of your research. So it might be that when you have some emerging findings, you want to go back to your participants and just check how that lands with them. And you might also think about alternative forms of reporting in some situations. So say if you have a very small sample, it might be that even if you strip out names and any other identifying information, it might be that because the sample's so small, that person could still be identified through the stories that they've told. So you might use something like there's examples like composite case studies or vignettes and things like that, which is basically where you would kind of jigsaw together different elements of different people's stories in a way that stops any individual people by being identifiable. So there's a lot of different sort of options you can use there, and there's discussion in the wider literature about those different options that you have. So the final principle is researcher safety, and I think in research ethics, because our focus is generally on the participants and keeping the participants safe, sometimes we forget that actually we need to really think about ourselves as researchers as well, and that's not just thinking about kind of physical risks, but also thinking about any potential for, it might be emotional or psychological harm to ourselves, and I think that can particularly be the case if you're doing research on a sensitive topic, or it might be a topic that you have lived experience of yourself, for example. It's really important just to think about any kind of emotional support that you might need, and any impact that it might have on you. And of course, our role when we're designing the research is to try and identify and mitigate any potential harms to ourselves and our teams, as well as to the participants. And the way that we might address that, so a lot of this again is stuff that you might be familiar with from your day job. So think about things like lone working protocols and risk assessments for the physical side, and just very careful planning. So thinking about transport, thinking about time of day, if you do research where you're planning to go into people's homes, thinking about, is that necessary? Are there any alternatives to that? And if it is necessary, you might want to think about that in terms of how you budget for the work or how you plan capacity. So it might be that, say, if you're going into people's homes, you might want to double up and have two of you go. So it's really important to think about all of that at the planning stage. And then thinking about debriefing, any sort of emotional support that you might need, and that could be internal or it could be through some kind of external training or sources of support as well. And again, as I mentioned on an earlier slide, I think self-reflexivity can be really important in this, and just thinking through, when you've done a few interviews or a few focus groups or whatever it is that you may be doing, just sort of sitting down and thinking through, okay, how is this impacting on me? Am I doing all right? Do I need any support? And just kind of being, just sort of really thinking about how it might be impacting you. So that is the end of the principles. I feel like I've whizzed through them because I've got through this quicker than I thought I would. So I'm just going to leave you with a few additional considerations. So these are things that we haven't really had time to talk about today, because we didn't have a huge amount of time. I've very much focused on the sort of procedural side of research ethics, if you like. But there are some other things that you might be interested to go away and think about. So these are the main sort of additional considerations. So one of them is what in academia what we would call situational ethics. And if we think about research ethics, so it's generally about trying to predict things in advance, so predicting anything that might go wrong, and then sort of planning for that. But actually, in reality, a lot of the issues that you come across will be things that you don't expect. So it's really important for us to try and plan for those as much as we possibly can, and just make sure that we kind of know what we would do in particular situations. So that might be something like developing a protocol for how you would deal with distress if someone became upset. as part of the research, you know, how would you support them, you know, who would you direct them to for support and things like that. It might also be thinking about what you would do if someone discloses any kind of malpractice or criminal behaviour. Or it might be dependent on the focus of your research that you might identify a safeguarding issue, for example. So it's really important, and it might be that you do that in written form, or it might be that you just do it through a conversation with other people in the team or with a manager or someone, just about thinking through, you know, so for example, for a safeguarding issue, who would you need to tell about that? Within the time, you know, what time frames do you need to work within, and just making sure that you have that all very clear. And the second additional consideration is in what we would call in academia relational ethics. And this is basically everything to do with the relationship between you as the researcher and your participants. So it's about how you navigate those relationships. And there's a lot of discussion, particularly around close relationships, which I think might be useful to sort of local authority and voluntary sector colleagues here. So if you have an existing relationship with the people who are involved in your research, there's a lot of discussion around how you navigate that, how you navigate any power imbalances, how you tell stories about people. You know, if they're people who you know already, it can be a bit of a minefield around how you write it up as well. And then finally, how to leave the research without people feeling like you've kind of abandoned them. So there's a whole set of issues in there, and I've included one paper, which is an open access paper on the resources list, which was a sort of reflective piece, someone who had done some research with people who they had a close relationship with already. And then finally, I promised at the start I would mention that what the link is between the ethical principles that we've just talked about and ethical approval processes. So formal ethical review, the way it works is that it's an independent panel of people who will look at your research ideas, and essentially what they do is judge your ideas against the principles that I've explained to you throughout this webinar, and then they give you an opinion about whether the research is ethically sound and whether you're okay to go ahead, and they might give you some suggestions about things that you need to change. So this happens before your research starts, and it's a requirement for most NHS research, some social care research, and pretty much all university research goes through this process. So if you're doing any research, if you're based in a university or you're doing research where you're collaborating with a university, it's likely that you will go through this process in one way or another. There isn't currently any requirement for formal ethical review for local authority or voluntary sector research, but we do have colleagues based at Southampton who are doing some work around this in terms of what an ethical review process might look like in a local authority setting. So watch this space for future work on that. So that's sort of additional considerations. I've included a bit of a summary here, just a bit of a checklist of all the things that we covered, but I won't talk through that just because I'm aware we're getting up to 1:45 now. So I'll leave that there just in case you want to go back through this and just have it as a bit of a checklist there around some of the sort of key fundamental things in research ethics. And then I've left you with a sort of set of resources here. So I would say if you only have time to look at one thing, I would really recommend the Social Research Association Research Ethics Guidance. I find all of their stuff, you know, it's very practical, it's very lay language, and they include a lot of case studies and things as well, which feel really helpful. So I'd say that's a really good place to start. The UK Data Service has some really great stuff as well, and they have a learning hub, but they also have a YouTube channel as well with recordings of past webinars and things like that. And then I've just included various other resources there, including some guidance on if you're doing research with potentially vulnerable groups, and I've also linked the Social Research Association's Code of Practice for Researcher Safety as well, so I'd recommend that's a really helpful read as well when you're getting started with your research. And then finally, I'm just on time, but I just wanted to leave you with this quote because I feel like it just really kind of reinforces how important research ethics is, particularly in the types of research we do where we're in the real world, you know, we're in the lives of participants. It might be people that we have some kind of pre-existing relationship with. And yeah, so this quote is from the British Sociological Association. I won't read it out. I think I might just leave it there for a second while we start doing the questions, if that's all right, and then people can just read it themselves, and then I won't go over the time. So I hope that worked. It's exactly 1:45, Nicola, so I hope you're impressed with my timekeeping there.
Brilliant, well done, Deb. A huge amount of content to get through there. So
I know. I hope it wasn't too rushed. Sorry if I spoke too quickly there.
Amazing timing. Yeah, so happy to open up the floor to any questions if anybody does want to raise their hand. I know there are some bits and pieces in the chat as well. So
I'll stop sharing there. Oh, I was going to stop sharing, but oh, there. Sorry, I lost the cross there. There we go. All right. So shall I go through the hands up comments, Nicola? Is that yes? So we've got Claire. Isn't it Claire Craig there as numbers? Hi, Claire.
Hello, thank you. That was really, really helpful and one of the clearest sort of explanations around ethics that I think I've ever come across. So thank you so much. So I'm a researcher at Essex County Council, and I'm working with the digital team at the moment on trying to establish a framework and for using AI ethically across the council, sort of in public services generally. And as a bit of a side quest that I've set myself, I'm trying to bring that sort of thinking to research work. So have you come across anything about, any guidelines, any activity being done about the sort of ethical use of AI in research generally?
I think that now I would have to go back and have a look, but I can if I write your name down, Claire, I can always get back in touch with you. But I think there has been a few webinars recently on things like that. I haven't seen it as much. I did look at a lot of different ethical frameworks when I was planning this presentation, and I think it almost feels like it's maybe slightly too early to have a lot of it written down, but I know there has been various kind of webinars and things like that. I think Nicola, did we do a webinar on AI? I think it was AI in qualitative analysis. But I can certainly have a dig around if you like and send things over when we send the slides out. I have to say I'm a bit of a traditionalist about research. I'm very nervous about AI, and I think because a lot of the free, my understanding is that a lot of the free tools, the data belongs to them. Anything that you put into the model would then belong to them as well as you, and obviously that has really big implications for particularly think about things like GDPR, data protection. So I think it's really my understanding is that if you use any kind of AI to help you do analysis, for example, you need to make sure that it's fully anonymized at the time that you put it in. So I think there's a lot of issues around sort of personal data and sensitive data and what that means if we're essentially sharing it with a language model or something. So I know there has been discussion around that, but I'm not sure how much of it has been written down, but I can certainly have a look and find out that if that's okay. Sorry to not be able to answer the first question.
No, I mean, that's kind of because I've been looking around and I haven't found anything yet. And I just feel like we're at the beginning of that conversation. We've sort of heard so much nonsense really about AI for so long. And I'm like you, I'm a bit of a traditionalist, not really looking forward to it kind of permeating into what we do. But just really, we want to kind of do this bit of work. Can we shut the stable door before the horse has bolted and get some ethical sort of thinking in this framework? So yeah, thank you, really helpful.
No, I think my interpretation is similar to yours, where I don't think there's a huge amount written down at the moment. I think there's a lot of conversations that are happening, kind of webinars and workshops and things like that, but as far as I'm aware, but I'll have a look when I come off, and then I can send it round to everyone when we send out the slides if there's anything that I can share. But
thank you very much.
I think that might be all of the was Claire the only hand up there, I think. So we can move to the chat if that, I think that was on. If anyone else has any they want to put the hand up for, please do. Otherwise, I'll have a look in the chat now. So let's, there's a lot in here. Hang on, I'll try and start from the top. Okay, so do you have any templates for participant information sheets and informed consent forms? So it's a tricky one. It can be tricky in a way to have proper templates for things like this because it's very individual. So the type of information that you need to include is very different for different types of study. Also, say if you're doing research in collaboration with a university or something, they often have their own templates, and they're similar but they're not identical, so it can be quite tricky. But we are, one of the things that we're doing at the Specialist Centre is creating a bit of a repository for things, and we do have forms that colleagues in local authorities and universities and other places have agreed that we're able to share. So that is something that I think, Nicola, I don't know if you know the timescales, but I'm assuming it's sort of New Year kind of time. We're hoping to be able to start to share some of those things. But I mean, I would be fine I would be okay to share, ones that I've used at the university. But you can. there are a lot of examples online. I think the SRA guidance and the UK Data Service have examples of specific wording for different sections and things like that, so that can be helpful. What I would say with the information sheets is the first time you create one, it always takes ages because you're trying to get the wording right. So I'd be sort of prepared to spend a bit of time the first time you do one, and then after that, you can almost use the one that you've got as a template for future studies, especially if you do similar sorts of research. So it feels like a big task with the first time you do one, but then after that it sort of gets a bit easier. But Nicola, do you have any information about, so with the repository, I'm assuming we do have information sheets and consent forms and things as part of the plan for that, is that right?
It's something that we're building up, yes, now that people are, there's a lot of different research projects underway. So we're getting some really good examples of those coming through. So yes, we'd be happy with permission of the people that have designed them.
So
obviously we'll be happy to share those. So once they're available, we'll flag round to everybody that we've got those held on our intranet page.
Yeah. But in the meantime, I think probably the UK Data Service might be the best place to look. If you look on their Learning Hub, I think they have not templates, but they have various examples. So there'll be wording within there that you can sort of pick that suits your particular purposes. So we've got a question here about is opt-in required for gatekeeper consent? That is a very good question and quite so it depends. So for example, different universities I've worked at have had different levels of sort of strictness on this. So one university I used to work at, you used to have to actually get like written informed consent from the organisations as well as individual people. So for example, parents for pupils, I think if their children are young people, yes, you definitely need parental consent. And there's a whole different set of ethical requirements if you're doing research with children and young people, which we haven't had a chance to talk about here. But if you look at the SRA website is a good starting point. I think they have some specific guidance around that. What I would say is, so you're thinking about the gatekeeper. Sometimes it would depend on the location of the research. So say if you're talking about doing research within schools, if you're planning to go on school premises or be kind of involved in that way, or if it's about the nature of the young person being at that school, yes, you would expect that you would need to get gatekeeper consent for that. If you're talking to kind of school children, but it's nothing to do with their school experience, you're not involving the school in any way. It might be about something in, a completely different experience. It might be like their experience of social media or something like that, for example. That in that situation you probably wouldn't, because you wouldn't need the gatekeeper. But it often depends on how you're planning to recruit people. So if you were planning to recruit people through the school, then yes, you would need the school to agree to it, and you probably would need the parents as well if it's young people. So there's quite a lot of different ethical guidelines that you need to look at if you're doing anything with children and young people. So that's worth going away and having a look at. I'll move on. Oh, sorry, Nicola, I just saw that you'd already replied to the do we have templates thing. Sorry, I'm a little bit behind us all here. So in the context of local authorities, how can ethical governance be best embedded that's fit for purpose, considering that they're not research institutions, despite they're doing research? I think I think there's a difference between ethical principles and ethical approval processes. And even if you're doing research in a situation where there isn't any kind of formal ethical approval process, for me, that doesn't mean that you can't do the research in an ethical way. So all of the things that we've talked about around kind of safety of the data, around giving people enough information for them to be able to decide whether or not to take part, I don't really feel like that's particularly context specific. So I've worked in the voluntary sector for a lot of years before I joined academia, and I've done a lot of local authority research and things like that, and we would always just follow these principles regardless of whether we're having it kind of formally approved or not. So I think having templates, having examples and things like that people can use just to sort of make it as I don't know what the opposite of onerous is, non-onerous, I'm not sure. But so, just sort of trying to help, because I appreciate that it takes a lot of capacity and a lot of work to do this. But as I said, I feel like the first few times you do something, it takes a lot of work, and then after that it becomes almost second nature when you're doing research. So I think it's just about sort of investing a bit of time in it, and then having templates and examples that people can then use. I'm not sure whether I really answered your question properly there, Fiona, so feel free to put your hand up if you wanted to sort of ask me anything else on that. So the experience of service, hang on, I'm Dutch, and use the experience of service users, but this has to be developed and supported by knowledgeable research expertise. Sorry, that was like half a sentence. I'm not sure what that start of that sentence was. But yes, yeah, absolutely agree. When if you're doing research with service users, it does take a bit of some background knowledge. And I think if you can, I think the sort of independence element of that can be really important as well. So if you're managing a service and you want to do research with the people that use it, if there's anyone else that you can bring in that has a sort of a bit of a distance from that, can be really helpful as well. Keeping ethics. Oh, great. So Fiona's from Essex County Council, so they have a research community of practice and an ethics review board. That would be amazing, Fiona, if you don't mind us getting in touch, because we're always interested in looking at case studies of practice, and when we develop the repository, having examples, if anyone's happy to share them and things like that. So that would be amazing if you don't mind us getting in touch with you on that. So let's have a look. Are there any resources designed for young researchers relating to ethics that you could share? Currently working on a project which we all have young people, actors, researchers. Yes, so that sounds almost like a sort of peer research model there. So sorry, I just realised I'm reading these questions to myself instead of reading them in a way where other people can understand. So this is about doing research in a project where young people are involved and where they're acting as researchers. So I guess there's two different elements of ethics that you can look at for that. So there is specific ethical guidance around doing research with young people, and then there's also a lot of considerations around the peer research model. So that will be where you develop a certain, research skills and work with a certain group of people, and then they sort of co-design the work and act as researchers as well with their particular peer group. And there's a lot of, it's a really, really great model, and there's quite a lot of sort of development work that's been done around that. But there are some specific ethical issues around making sure that the peer researchers are properly supported and things like that. So there's sort of two different elements. I don't know of anything off the top of my head, but again, with the AI stuff, I can have a quick look when I come off here, and if there's anything that I can find that's specific to that, I can send it over. So I'm just writing a note there. So young people and sort of peer researchers as well. I think this is probably like last question. Would you say, Nicola? I won't do any more from this, so I'll just have a look. So can you tell us more about mitigating risks when working with a local authority where requests may need to go via a line manager or gatekeeper? Or where participation could be viewed as fitting within someone's job description? Yeah. So for me, I think this is just, it kind of goes back to the informed consent and just making sure that you are very, very clear with people that just because they work in a certain job or just because they have existing relationships, that doesn't mean that they have to take part. And thinking about the sort of relational ethics discussion that I mentioned on one of the later slides, there is discussion around that about what, if you're a researcher but you also have another hat which is as a worker, and you're trying to do research with your own colleagues, there's a fair bit of discussion around that, around how you kind of manage that relationship. But I would say a lot of it is just being very clear and trying to separate those two roles out. So it might even be, if you're talking to people about the research before it starts, just saying to them, you know me as this job title, but actually this is a piece of research I'm doing which is completely separate, and there's absolutely no pressure at all to take part. So I think a lot of it is just about sort of how you describe things and just making that demarcation really clear, I think. And then I think that's probably a bit the one final one here about it would be helpful to have guidance about understanding the circumstances when it's necessary to escalate to an ethics board. So yeah, that would generally be any of the stuff that was in that higher risk column would be things where you would consider sending it for formal ethical review if you have that option available to you. So it might be if you work in collaboration with a university or something, it might be that they're able to take a look at it. So yeah. But it's worth bearing in mind that all the ethical review panel does is measure your ideas against the principles. So if you focus on the principles and making sure that you make it as ethically sound as you possibly can, that is what the ethical review board would be focusing on anyway. And so I'll stop now because it's 12 o'clock. So Nicola, I don't know if you wanted to say anything just before we go. I'm sorry, there was a couple of other questions. I'll have a look at them when I come off the call.
Yes, just a really quick thank you, Deb. Thank you so much. We'll try and get round everybody with some answers to anything that was not quite addressed fully. But thank you all so much for attending, and we'll see you all again soon. Next webinar is Thursday of next week. It's LGBTQ+ communities, investing in research within those communities and how to do it with confidence, use the right language, build engaging relationships, that kind of thing. So hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, bye.